Okay, we should be good to go. All right. So, as always, if you guys have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. But for now, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to be looking at the free response questions. So this is a welcome, pretty standard stuff. It's very, this is AP, but we don't represent 5.5 does not represent AP, does not represent College Board, just kind of run one-of-the-mill stuff. Don't take any of this as like official practice or anything. This is, very unofficial, run by students, but I'm happy to help if you guys need any help as well. So, as far as the agenda, we're going to first go over the course project, which is going to be 10% overall. We're not going to go very much into this because you should have already submitted everything for that. And then we'll go through, excuse me, the written responses 1 and 2, and then we'll do some practice. Cool. So, written response 1 does not need a PPR. Just in case there's anybody here that has not submitted a PPR and it's too late. I don't know. I'm not sure how that works exactly, but I'm assuming it's too late to do that now. So if that applies to you, then the max you can get for your free response questions is going to be 50%, which is going to take off about 15%, excuse me, of your grade overall. Okay, so you can still get a 4 with that. So if you guys have your PPR or your screenshots, please take this time to go ahead and get those set up so you guys can reference them while we kind of talk about or talk through some of the free responses. And so you guys can kind of figure out how you would respond to those free responses if we were asked them on test day. Okay, note. Oh, yes. Okay, so I'm not going to be covering some of the scoring guidelines have very specific kind of minute details in them, so I'm not going to be covering everything in them, but I will be going over like the more general areas. So the course project, and actually before we get completely started here, I'm going to leave some links in the chat. So that's going to be the lecture feedback form. So at any point, if you guys have any positive or negative experiences with the lecture, I'd be love it if you guys could fill that out. That helps us, improve our lectures specifically. So I take that feedback, and like very much use them to guide the lectures. And then, of course, the lecture schedule as well. Thank you, Vivalicious. And then, of course, the lecture schedule as well, if you guys want to look at any upcoming lectures or to access this slideshow as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the course project. Oh, and one more thing, if you've already filled out the lecture feedback form, you can always fill it out again, specifically for this lecture, because it's a little bit different format. So, okay, course project. So the 10% is just saying that this is going to be worth 10% of your grade overall on the exam. You should have already done it, and the PPR is not needed in grading. So if you go ahead and submit your code and PPR and video, that's what you should have already done. And then these are the two things that you're going to be looking for. So the video, which is supposed to assess your ability to implement and apply an algorithm. Almost everybody gets the video point. I think it's like a 90% about. So that's should be a free point. And then the program requirements basically is just assessing your ability to, same thing, implement and apply an algorithm. So that's going to be your PPR and video, your code. All right, so that should be, oh yes, and the scoring guidelines for this. If your friend got 1 out of 6, they probably submitted the video, and that's where they got their point. So this is kind of what I'm saying. Like, I'm not going to go over like all of these specific bullet points, but the idea is if your video contains the input, the output, and your program functioning, then you should get this point. And then if your program contains a list, procedure, a call to procedure, selection, and iteration, you get this point. So as long as you guys kind of do both of these, you should be good. Sorry to ask, but is the PPR part of our AP score? Yeah, so it's not specifically like part of your score, but you do need it to address written response 2 for each of these points. So there's going to be 3 questions as a part of written response 2. So you do need the PPR. The PPR is called I think it's a personalized project reference. So basically you can take 4 screenshots of your code, and they like make you take specific screenshots, but you take screenshots of your code, and that is what you can reference on test day to answer these questions. Yes, so it's like a reference sheet for you. All right, so that is the course project. Any questions with that before we actually dig into the meat and potatoes of the lecture? All right, so let's do it. So written response 1, this is going to be typed on test day. And the idea is that it's going to assess your ability to investigate the situation, context, or task behind your program. So in other words, questions like who is supposed to be using this program? What's your program's purpose, right? What functionality does it have? The idea is it's going to test the context behind your program, right? And so you shouldn't actually need to reference your PPR for this. You'll have it with you, I believe. I'm not positive about that, but you should be able to reference it if you needed it. But this is just really testing the overall kind of what is your program doing and what's it about, what's it for. Yes, this will be on YouTube. Don't worry about that. They should print it out for you. Perfect. Great. So yeah, that's the idea with this one. So you can see here, these are the different questions that you could be asked essentially, right? So these are called learning objectives. And all these are saying are, these are the types of questions that you could be asked, or this is what this question is going to attempt to test you, essentially. If you mess up your row 6, are you screwed? I don't know what you mean by that. Can you clarify? All right. So, for example, they could ask you to describe the purpose, explain how your program functions, identify your inputs and outputs. These should be the easiest questions of your life right here. Inputs and outputs of your program, guys. But we'll go over that. Develop a program using development process. So they could ask you like, how did you go about developing your program? What's your user interface? How did you develop that? And then describe the purpose of a code segment. So if you messed up your calls, like the call to procedure, not necessarily. They may not ask you about your calls. If you're talking about your code, I think as long as your code doesn't have an error, it should be good. Perfect. Yes. So if your code is error, even if it's like has a small logic error or something, I think as long as it has like the things that they wanted, so the list procedure, all this stuff, you should be good. Will they only get one of this? Yes. So the idea is you'll get one or multiple of these. So it could be multiple, but it could also only be one. What's an input and output? That's essentially what does your code take in and what does it put out? So for example, an input might be if your user types in the word hello, that's your input, the word hello from being gotten from the user. And then if it does something, changes that string to make it reverse the string, right? So ELLOH or whatever. I don't know. OLLEH, right? That would be your output. Are these the exact questions they'll ask? They will be worded differently. That's a great question. So these are what they're going to be testing you on, but they could be worded differently. So, but as long as you can kind of read what they're telling you and understand what they're saying, and then kind of answer that question, I can guarantee you that they're going to be testing one of these, what we call learning objectives, or in other words, one of these concepts. It's only one question for the first written response 1. The second written response 2 will have 3 questions. Okay, cool. If your project is a survey, each answer you click on in the multiple choice will be the input. That's exactly right. So they may only ask you to identify one input, right? And that would just be like, the first thing that your user inputs, right? The first multiple choice question. Yeah, no worries, Swat, no worries. Is it 4 questions? Yes. Great question. Great question. So the question is it 4 questions? And if so, then how is it actually marked out as 6? Well, if we go back to the first part here, the course project is going to have 2 points in it. So that's going to be for the course project video and the program requirements. Then the second one is going to come, the third point is coming from your written response 1, and then the written response 2 has 3 points within it. So we'll go over more specifically, but it's going to actually be made up of 6 different points within those 4 questions. So that makes sense. Okay. Is the whole exam 70 multiple choice questions and 6, 4 of your responses? Yep. All right. So for example, let's take a look at this example prompt that could be asked of you as far as question number 1. So identify an expected user of your program. Describe what one way your program's design meets the need of this user. So we see how they're asking really 2 questions here in one. First, identify the user, and then describe the way your program meets the need of it, right? So I'll leave you guys maybe 2 minutes here, pretty quick, to just kind of look over your PPR if you have it out, kind of formulate an answer, how you would answer this question in your head, and then we'll go over the answer. How many sentences should you have? As many as you need to answer the question. So identify, we'll go over what the verbs mean in the MISC section here, but identify just means kind of 1 sentence, what is this? Describe means a couple sentences to kind of go into detail, but you don't necessarily need to justify anything. Previous slide, sure. All of these will be on, you can access all of these slides. Again, I'll send the link. It's gonna be the second link there for the schedule, and then just you can find today's date, and you'll be able to access these slides. All right, so I'm gonna go back to this one just so that we can all see. The AB, these. You don't need to worry about the letters and what these codes are. These are in the CED for your teachers to know, if that makes sense. So you don't need to know about the letters or anything. These are just like 2.A, 2.B. These are what we call skills. And so they're, again, just part of the CED. You don't need to know what those are or anything. Just focus on the words, on what they're asking. All right, so let's go over the scoring guidelines. Any questions, by the way, with this slide? Let me answer those first. You don't get what those are questions are asking. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look, for example, right? So we don't need to worry about CRD-2.A. All we need to know is describe the purpose of computing innovation. So if we can describe what the purpose of our function or our code is, that we're good, right? So that checks off that one. So the idea behind these lists are if we can kind of go down the list and say, check, I can do that, check, I can do that, I can do that, and then we're good. Does that make sense? How long should it be? Again, it just depends on what they're asking. So identify just like a sentence or two, describe a couple sentences, but not necessarily like a huge paragraph or anything. They don't need to be very long. We'll take a look at some sample free responses from real students, and we'll take a look and see what they do. So maybe hold that question until we get there. So Vivalicious, just to confirm, you're talking about these letters, right? Because if they're asking who is your program for, and I say people looking for entertainment, yes, that should be fine. Yep. Okay, so develop a program that using a development process. So all this is saying, yes, gotcha. So all this is saying is, what is the process that you undertook to storyboard, plan out what you were going to do before you developed your program? Does that make sense? So development process is how you developed your program. Design a program and its user interface. That's quite literally designing how your program is going to look, right? How your user is going to interact with your program. And then this last one is describe the purpose of the program. Is essentially just saying what is it doing? What's the purpose of it? And writing documentation is saying how did you use comments or other documentation to note what you did in your program. A is saying yes, that's a good question. So A is more general. What's the purpose of your program as a whole? G is saying, if I give you a code segment, what is this code segment doing? Do you choose a code segment with G? That's a great question. That is just going to depend on what the specific question is, right? So as long as you can like go through a code segment and describe what the purpose is, then you're good. The specifics of like, can I choose it? What are they going to ask specifically? That's something that's going to come up on a case-by-case basis. I don't really know. This is about your project. These are all going to be about your project. Good question. All right, so I'm not going to be able to grade your specific things just because I don't have enough time to like read through everybody's. But maybe somebody suggested going through like ChatGPT and saying if you get the point, maybe that can help. But if we look at the scoring guidelines for this one, if you identify the expected user of your program and describe one way the program's design meets the need of that user, you should be good. Does that make sense? So specifically, if you must relate the program's design to the needs of the user. So in other words, if I said the user becomes entertained, there you go. That's relating the two, right? The user, or in other words, like for example, I made a trivia quiz about The Office, right? It's a great television show. You guys should love it. I love it. It's great, right? But the idea is you need to say, okay, this program was written for The Office superfans, right? And then you can say this program is supposed to provide entertainment or test the knowledge of, right? Be entertaining for The Office superfans by giving them a trivia quiz. Does that make sense? So you're connecting the two. And again, that's just the specific answer to this question specifically, but the idea is in general, these are what you could be asked about. All right, any questions with written response one before we move on to written response two? Okay, so in that case, let's go ahead and move on to written response two. Um, what I'll say for all of y'all who are like trying to answer the questions right now is we'll go over more specific, like a specific practice set to do later as well. So kind of think about how you would write it out for these first couple, like going over them in general, and then in the practice section, we'll actually start writing them out. So just kind of think about it for now. Is FRQ the hardest part of the exam? It just depends on how you take your test. What your strengths and weaknesses are, it's hard to tell. All right, so written response two. This is again going to be typed on test day. And this is, in my opinion, the most wide-ranging for response. So it's going to be testing knowledge of your code in general, right? So if the last one was testing the context of your code, then this one's going to be testing the knowledge of your code, specifically your code, right? How does it work? And that's really what 2 is all about, but 2A specifically. So these could be a lot of different things, but it's going to really revolve around sequencing, selection, and iteration. So again, this is going to basically test your ability to explain how a code segment or program functions. So this is where you're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of your code using your PPR and saying exactly how your program is functioning. So any questions in general for this one before I move on to, well, actually, we can go here. So, let's stay on topic in the chat. It looks like we're starting to talk about writing messages to the graders, and instead, let's talk more about this class. This is the general gist of free response two. I need help from the multiple choice. You can come to see us on Monday or tomorrow. Monday, yes. We're going to be doing, or come see Freddie tomorrow or us on me on Monday. We're going to be doing lots of multiple choice prep. Okay. Yes. Don't worry. I'm going to be focusing on multiple choice for the rest of the week. This is two. This is 2A. So when I say there's 4 multiple free response questions, I'm talking about 1 and then 2A, 2B, and 2C. So let's go on to this. This is, again, the general list of what you could be asked, right? So if you can kind of go down the list and say, oh, I know how to do that. I know how to do that. We're all good, right? So the first one is explain how a programmer code segment functions. So this is the same one as the last one, right? Evaluate expressions that use relational operators. So can somebody remind me what the difference between relational and logical operators are? Logical operators are the and or and not, right? Yes, exactly. So relational are straight up relating two things, right? So one thing is greater than the other thing, or one thing is equal to the other thing, right? Logic operators are saying combining two things together with logic, right? Is this one the same as this one, right? It's kind of it's a kind of a nuance, but logic is the and or not. Relation is comparing two things, specifically two numbers. Relational, yes, gotcha. Okay. Um, so the next one then is determine the result of conditional statement. So if you're asked to, identify the first conditional statement in your procedure, what does that mean? Well, it means we look for the first if statement in the procedure, right? And that's going to be our first conditional statement. Um, what if your program doesn't have logical operators or something? What do you do? That's a great question. So if you don't have if the project was required to have a logical operator or something, if it doesn't matter, right? If your project was required to have something, then they're going to expect you to have that in your project, and they could ask you about it, right? If you don't have it, then kind of tough luck, you've kind of given up that question, right? But if I'm remembering correctly, you don't need to have a logical operator. Is that right? I don't remember. Um, I'm like almost positive you're required to have a conditional statement because that's part of selection, right? But I don't think you need specific logical operator. Um, So, or like a relational operator specifically. So if you don't have something like that, then they're not gonna, they could give you another option, right? If that shows up, they should give you another option to do if you're not required to have it, if that makes sense. So they could be like saying, for example, they could say, identify the first relational operator in your code, right? And then they may ask you a question about that. And then afterwards, they say, if your code doesn't have a relational operator, then do this, or what does this mean? Or explain what your code does in detail, or something like that, right? So they'll give you options depending on whether you have it or not. Does that make sense? They've done that before. And actually, I think we'll see an example of that right now. Yes, Roy, absolutely. Okay. Next one, determine the result of the conditional statements. We said that. Express an algorithm that uses iteration without using a programming language. Okay, so this is basically just saying, can I write something in English, right? Yes, that relation also is including equal sign. Yes, yes, it is. And or not is logic, and everything else is relational. That's a good way to think about it. Determine the result or side effect of an iteration statement. So if you're given a for loop or some sort of loop, right? If your code has a loop and they say, okay, identify your first iteration statement, they may say, what is it doing, right? What is the result of your iteration statement? That's what that question is asking, right? Compare multiple algorithms to determine if they yield the same result or side effect, right? So this is just saying if is for example, is there another way that you could write your procedure, right? And what side effects would that way have? Does that make sense? Create algorithms, combine, modify existing algorithms, all this sort of stuff is something that could be asked in 2A. So any questions before we move on from these? You don't know if there's another way of writing your code? It's okay. Maybe you can think about that before test day. It's not like a huge deal, right? I don't think you would need to know like, oh, I don't think you need to rewrite your procedure in a different way or anything. Just kind of think about it, right? Can you explain the compare one again? Yes. Compare multiple algorithms to determine if they yield the same side effect or result. So one way they could ask you this is to ask you, is there another way of writing your procedure? And if there is, what different side effects may this have? Or something like that, right? So the idea is given another procedure or given some other sort of way of writing your code, what different side effects or results make that imply, right? What are the implications of that other kind of uh, algorithm? What do you mean by the last point, combine and modify? Great question. So if you have an algorithm, and for example, you want to say, say your algorithm, for example, takes two numbers and adds them together, right? But you want to take that algorithm and make it able to multiply two numbers together instead. That would be modifying an existing algorithm. Does that make sense? Yeah, iteration just means doing something over and over again. So that would be like a loop, right? So that when we think of like doing something over and over again, that's kind of the definition of what a loop is, right? So iteration just implies a loop. And so when I say a specific iteration, that just means a specific run of the loop or a specific kind of iteration of the loop. Does that make sense? Wouldn't the last few be unrelated to your PPR though? I thought all of them were directly related to your PPR. Great question. So the idea is these last couple ones, they could like almost mask within a question relating to your PPR. So for example, in this last one, maybe they say something like design a new or design a maybe they say like take your algorithm and implement a new thing or like design a new addition to your algorithm. Something like that, right? Where they're like taking these and kind of putting them inside of a question that they could ask you relating to your algorithm. That's the idea with this whole thing, right? All of these are things that they could put into a question and ask about your algorithm. So, any other questions on this slide before I move on to a sample version of this response question? Would we need to use pseudocode to explain it or just describe it really well? That's a great question. They could ask you, for example, um, uh, you know, write a procedure or describe a procedure or explain this procedure in detail, right? That just implies English. English is fine. I've never seen them say write code. right? Because they can't really do that because they don't really know what programming language you're using, right? So you can write pseudocode, and that is an absolutely great way, and we'll see about that later, actually, how we can use pseudocode to our advantage here. But it's not going to be needed. Can you give an example of an algorithm without using programming language one? What do you mean by that? Can I give an example of the algorithm without using programming language one? Could if you could clarify that. Could they ask about the potential users of your program and have you explain them? Yeah, so that would be what question one, written response one, is going to do, because that potential users are the context uh, of your program. So that's all about written response one. Not all free responses are about your PPR. Great question. So free response one is about your project in general and the context behind it. Uh, so the rest of them are going to be specifically about your PPR. If we were to use pseudocode, can we use the reference sheet or is that only multi? I believe you still can use the reference sheet. Yes. Oh, no worries, Max. Not a problem. Okay. 2.j. Let me take a look. Express an algorithm that uses iteration without using a program. Ah, gotcha. Okay. Yes. Yes. So, all that means is writing your algorithm in English. So saying in detailed steps, how could I read this explanation and then be able to write the code afterwards in any language? Does that make sense? Oh, it's a no reference sheet? Oh, okay. Good to know. Yeah, so you could say something like for that one, for example, um, if, you know, make an if statement or make a conditional statement that checks whether apples equals red, right? Just check on AP Classroom. On your AP exam, this will only be available on section one. Oh, there you go. That's good to know. So yeah, no reference sheet for free responses. But if you know any pseudocode, you can write it and you'll see how we do that. Good to know. Thank you for doing that. Yes, of course. This lesson is going to be recorded and it's going to be posted onto YouTube, the Five Hive YouTube channel. And also it'll be available in the lecture schedule once it's done there. And I can link that again. Yep. So the top one is the lecture feedback form. If you guys are enjoying this or want to leave me feedback, you can use that. And the bottom is the lecture schedule. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at a sample prompt. So consider the first iteration statement included in the procedure section of your personalized project reference. Identify the number of times the body of your iteration statement will execute. Describe a condition or error that would cause your iteration statement not to terminate and cause an infinite loop. If no such condition or error exists, then explain how the loop could be modified to cause an infinite loop. So just how we were saying, like if it's not possible for you to actually have something in your code, then they're going to have to give you a alternative, right? So this is exactly what we see here, right? If the condition doesn't exist, then you can do something else, right? So I'll leave you guys maybe a couple minutes, 2 minutes or so, just to kind of think about how you would respond to this, and then we'll move on. So what reference sheet do you not have? The idea is for the multiple choice section, you're going to have a reference sheet that explains what the pseudocode and block code questions are going to like, what they're going to mean, what they're going to look like. For the second section, the free response session, since you're not actually going to be writing pseudocode mainly, you're not going to actually have access to that because they're not going to expect you to need it, if that makes sense on the second section here. Would it be like to do greater than one so the code always runs? Oh, so yeah. So for this one, we'll see exactly the scoring guidelines are, but essentially it's going to just be dependent on your code, right? So that's why it's kind of hard to talk about these, um, but you'll see. Could you just change it to repeat forever code? Yeah. So the idea is to describe an error. Yeah. So that would be considered an error, right? Anything that would cause an infinite loop should be considered an error, in my opinion. Let's see what Armand says. So an appropriate answer might say, quote, iteration statement runs 5 times since the input is being chunked by a character in a 5-letter word. We could change the loop header to be for int I equals 0 to I is less than 100, I minus minus, and this would cause the loop to never terminate because I will always be lower than 100. Yeah, that's exactly. I think that would be a great response. Let's take a look at what the scoring guidelines say. So the response says either identify first, they have to identify the number of times the body of the iteration statement will execute. So if in your code, you have to be able to say when your loop is going to stop, essentially. And the response also describes a condition that would cause an infinite loop, or if that doesn't exist, explains how the loop could be modified to cause an infinite loop. And then, of course, you have these kind of specific on the right-hand side. These are more specific points that you may want to look at, right? So any questions with this 2A before we move on to 2B? Okay. Sorry, you said we need to tell them how our code terminates. You don't necessarily need to tell them how it terminates. You just need to tell them, you need to identify how it terminates and then tell them the number of times your code is going to run or your loop is going to run, right? Based off of that. Are all loops supposed to be able to be modified to make an infinite loop? Yeah. So the idea is that you should be able to change how you're going through your loop, right? So for example, if you have a for loop, like Armand did, for example, you can change the index that you're using to iterate that or how that index is changing to go the other way, for example, right? So it'll never terminate. Does that help? Perfect. What do I say when my index is 0 and set less than the length of the multiple choice options? So, for example, if you say, so that's what I'm saying, right? If you change the way your index is iterating, instead of adding one until you get to the number of multiple choice section, options, you can say -1, right? And then you'll never reach the number of multiple choice options, right? Takes a user input parameter and loops it that many times. Well, if you change, it all depends on how many or how you're actually changing your loop, right? So for example, if you change the way you're looping, instead of saying, I want to add one until I get to the number of times my user says, you can say, I want to decrease one, right? And that will never actually reach the number that the user says. That make sense? Yep. All right, let's go ahead and move on. So, written response 2B. This is also going to be typed on test day, and this is all going to be about the errors that your code could have, whether that's the type of error specifically, discovering the errors, how you went about debugging, how you could go about debugging, right? It's all about that. So they could ask you, for example, to create an error of a certain type, how explain how you test for errors, all that kind of stuff, right? So recently what I've seen is that they've been focused on writing calls to your procedures to be able to test it or debug it. So for example, write two calls that produce the same outcome, write two calls that cause different parts to trigger, right? Writing calls to procedure, right? So this is where you might be maybe asked to actually write code is actually to write a call that could be used to test your procedure. So this is all about testing and errors and all that stuff. So specifically, these are the learning objectives. You need to be able to identify an error, correct an error, and basically be able to test your error or test your code. What happens if there's a small error in my code that I notice after I submitted everything? My video doesn't show it. I am not sure. I think as long as your code still kind of meets all the criteria that we went over before, which is I think it was like a list, a procedure, a call to procedure, iteration, uh, sequencing, something like that, right? As long as you have all those things, you should still be good, and then you can answer your questions like this accordingly. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at a sample prompt. So consider the procedure included in part one of the procedure section of your personalized project reference. Describe a change to your procedure that will result in a runtime error. Explain why this change will result in a runtime error. So again, I'll leave it to you guys. I'll spend a couple minutes kind of answering questions, kind of thinking about how we might do this, that kind of thing. Taking a look at some of your guys' responses. A runtime error is when it never stops. That is an example of a runtime error, right? So a runtime error just means you were able to press run and the code actually ran and then it encountered an error, right? So a syntax error is not a runtime error because that is an error that will actually not allow your code to run in the first place, right? If you, for example, if you're in like Java or something, right, and you forget a semicolon, your code will just straight up not be able to run because you have to fix that error before you can click run, right? A runtime error is something where you can click run and then you experience the error. So whether that's an infinite loop, something like that, right? Um, a runtime error is separate from a logic error. So a runtime error, so a logic error is like specifically the specific case where your procedure or your code returns the wrong thing, right? Runtime error is it'll actually cause the code to not work, but you've been able to press play, if that makes sense. Wait, is this about errors you found while making? Yeah, so this is so rat. This is about kind of testing your code to find errors or creating error in your code or something about errors, right? So it could be about what asking about your experience writing the code. It could be about how you may change your code, all sorts of stuff, right? But it's all about errors. Um, this is the feedback. You have to. All right. Any questions here before? Actually, let's go ahead and move to the scoring guidelines. Um, so, uh, this may be a dumb question, but will you be able to see your code on Tesla? Yes, you'll be able to use your personalized project reference, which you should have completed and turned into the College Board already. Okay, so, for example, for this question's scoring guidelines, here's what we have. So we want to describe a change to the procedure that will result in a runtime error and explain why that change will result in runtime errors, right? So it's pretty much just straight up what the question is asking, right? So as long as you did these two things, you're good. This is very straightforward. Just like if you did these two things, you're good, right? But you have to make sure that in the context of your code, these are correct, right? And that's what they're looking for. Um, Okay, it looks like let's take a look. This may be a stupid question, but if I change dog screen or cat screen to things that don't exist in the program, would these be runtime errors? Exchange the cat variable to something that doesn't exist. So if you change the cat something that doesn't exist, yeah, so a runtime error is going to be specifically looking for a a thing that's going to stop your code, right? And actually, why don't we take a look at the CED just to remind ourselves what a APCSP CED? Just remind ourselves what a runtime error is, so that we're all on the same page. Does that work? So a runtime error is a mistake in the program that occurs during the execution program. So when I say you can click run, this is what I mean, right? It occurs during the execution. Programming language define their own runtime errors. So that's different from a logic error where it causes the behavior to be wrong because a runtime error actually stops the code, right? It has to be completely stopping the code, right? So while logic errors do occur during runtime, it doesn't actually cause a real error, quote unquote, because runtime errors are going to stop your code. All right. So that's going to be if you, for example, put like something that doesn't exist, that could be considered a logic error, right? Let's go to here. So the question was, what's an example of a runtime error? I believe we covered this in uh, one. Let's take a look. And there was a chart that we filled out about about examples. So runtime errors, division by zero is a great one, right? Or infinite loop. So you don't necessarily need to be able to stop it, right? Because an infinite loop is just going to keep going, 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 right? Until eventually it may stop, eventually it may not, right? But the idea is, yes, the infinite loop would be a runtime error. Yep. Whereas a logic error is going to still kind of give you an answer, right? It's going to give you one answer. It's not going to give you an infinite amount of answers, right? That's what the difference is. What about not being able to identify the item in your list? Um, so yeah, so if you mean like, for example, you have a list and you are looking for an item and you change what item you're looking for, then that may be a runtime error, right? Because you're not going to be able to find the specific thing that you're looking for, and that's going to stop your code prematurely. All right. If I were to set count to dog instead of one, would that be considered a runtime error? Yes, is as long as so as long as your program runs, it sounds like that would let it run, but it would just be wrong, right? So yeah, that and it just wouldn't like you'd be able to press play, but then it wouldn't actually make sense, right? So that sounds correct. Would deleting items in a list also be a runtime error when you're not supposed to? Yeah, and so like for example, if you delete an item prematurely and then you that kind of causes things to go wrong later in your code, yeah, absolutely. Yes, that would be a runtime error, Jenna. Okay. So if I had a non-existent multiple choice question, would that be a runtime error? I don't know what really the context of your code, so that's pretty hard to answer, unfortunately. If I remove something from my list and the user selected, that would be a runtime error. Um, Sounds like it, but again, it's hard to tell without seeing your guys' like code specifically. So, but it's going to be we don't have enough time to like look at your codes specifically. So, take a look at kind of the definition of runtime errors. Take a look at kind of what you could even ask an AI bot. Sure, that's fine, right? Maybe verify that online somewhere, right? Or with your teacher, but just kind of see if you can do that in you know what I mean? You see if you can do that, right? Okay. So yeah, so a logic error. So okay, it sounds like we're confused on the difference between logic errors and runtime error. Yes, computer science has true response now. So a logic error again is going to cause the behavior of your program to be incorrect, right? And so the idea is if the behavior of your program is incorrect, then you're still going to get an answer. It's just going to be the wrong answer, right? Runtime errors is going to be you allow your program to start, but that program once you start it is not either not going to stop or going to stop prematurely because of an error. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So let's go ahead and move on then. So, all right, 2C, typed on test day. A logic error would just be the program still running but doing the wrong thing. Exactly. Yep. All right, so typed on test day, 2C. This is often called the hardest response. In my opinion, you can actually prepare for this the easiest, and you'll see how. There's two different possibilities that you could be asked about. The first is the more common, which is using lists to cause abstraction, right? So remember, abstraction just means having something that's really complex, for example, 15 different variables, and saying, okay, I'm gonna generalize this to become only one variable, but use a list to go through each different one, right? So abstraction using lists is more common, and so they could ask you to write an algorithm using your list, explain how your list manages complexity, or output trace an algorithm on your list. So what I mean by this, if a function call, if a function, if sorry, if given a function to call, for example, is valid is a common one, right? It must work on every data type. So all that means is if you're given a function and they tell you to call that function in a specific algorithm that you're writing, you should be able to call that function, right? Because it's going to work with every question. Valid response might be replacing the equal sign with is equal. Yes, we'll actually see. I believe that's actually this is equal is actually the exact question. Yeah, is equal. So we'll go over that. We'll go over that. All right. The other type is procedural abstraction, slightly less common, right? So what that means is how did you use a procedure to manage the complexity of your code? It's the exact same thing as a list, right? So the answers are the exact same. And the answer is, I'll tell you right now, if they ask you how did your list or how did your procedure manage complexity using abstraction, this is your answer, okay? You say, if I didn't have this list or this procedure, I would need X amount of statements, right? I would need, X amount of variables, for example, instead of using a list to use one variable stored in the list. Does that make sense? So instead of needing, for example, 20 different variables, I can use a list that's stored in one variable to store all the same things. That manages complexity. That's the answer they're looking for. Procedure is saying instead of doing 20 different things, right? It's 20 different statements. I can just call the procedure once, right? And it saves a lot of, it generalizes it. So if I have 50 items on the list, I would need at least 50 if statements. Exactly, right? If I have 50 items on my list, instead of having to have 50 variables to store each item individually, I can just have all those variables in a list and store them in one variable, and that manages complexity. There you go. That's your answer. That's a very common question they could ask you, and that's all you need to say. That's literally the word for word. Yes. Oh, yeah. That guy, you're exactly right. Because I took it 2 years ago or whatever without this. They just moved the writing part to the exam to make sure that people actually know what they're doing. Hopefully you get that. Yeah. Okay. So here is here's the list of what you could be asked, right? These are the lists. This is the list again of the learning objectives. So develop data abstraction using lists. That's what we just said, right? Explain how the use of data abstraction manages complexity. This is more specifically what we just did, right? We say because we can iterate through the list doing all the and just writing the statements once instead of writing 50 kind of the same statements, right? If your abstraction can move to the next screen in just a couple of lines of code instead of repeating the set screen 8 times, exactly. Yeah. So instead of writing all of the code 8 times, you can just say, oh, I can just do that in a loop and write the code once. And that's managing abstraction. Sorry, managing complexity using abstraction. Write iteration statements to traverse a list. So as long as you can iterate through a list, you'll be good. Determine the result of an algorithm that includes list traversal. So as long as you can understand what a loop iterating through a list is doing, then you'll be good. So, uh, for example, if I have a list called numbers, right? And I want to add one to every number on that list, instead of saying, okay, the number at index 1 plus 1, the number at index 2 plus 1, the number at index 3 plus 1. I can write a loop that says for example, I is equal to 0, I is less than number of elements, right? And go through and say the lists at that index I want to add 1 to that, okay? So that what I end up getting is just one loop with one statement in it instead of having 10 different statements doing the same thing. Explain how the use of procedural abstraction manages complexity. Procedural is the same thing except using procedures instead of lists. So um, instead of saying I'm going to have a list that and go through that, I can say instead of having to write out, and this is exactly how I don't know how to say your name, but it's some it's a character that I don't recognize. But this is when you're talking about like the you know multiple choice questions, right? And the survey or whatever, right? And you're saying I have to do this thing 8 times. Well, instead of writing out all of the statements 8 different times, you can put them all into a procedure, right? And just call that procedure 8 times. Okay, so let's take a look at this sample prompt. Suppose you're provided with a procedure called is equal. The procedure returns true if the two parameters value 1 and value 2 are equal in value and returns false otherwise. Using the list you provided in the list section of your personalized project reference, explain in detailed steps an algorithm that uses is equal to count the number of items, count the number of times a certain value appears in your list. Your explanation must be detailed enough for someone else to write the code. No, no, no. So sorry. So you're not going to be able to pick which ones you do want to do. So you can't pick either procedure or list. But what I'm saying is these are the two that you could be asked, right? You could be asked either list or procedure. So you need to know both. List is more common, um, but as long as you know both, they're pretty similar. So let's look at this one. Those are the only two types of abstraction that this course covers. So those are the only two that they could ask you on the test, specifically for 2C. And if you look at these learning objectives, you see all of these first, whatever, 5 are lists, right? All these first 4, I should say, are lists. And then this last one is the procedure one. So does anybody have any ideas about how we could use this is equal to kind of write this algorithm? The reason why this question, by the way, is so hard is because they want you to do it in detailed steps so that someone else could write the code, right? That's why this is difficult. So what do you guys think? How could we do this? Do I have to do this in paragraph format or am I able to write 1, 2, 3, 4? Yes, you're able to do 1, 2, 3, 4 or paragraph. It's up to you. Sometimes they ask you, how does your parameter manage complexity in your custom procedure? So what that would mean is, how does your procedure, right? So for example, if you have a procedure that does something, right? And you are passing in a parameter, the idea is instead of having to write out each of those parameters or whatever that parameter that you're doing that inside of your program, what the writing all the code for your procedure with that parameter, that is so okay. Let me clear this up, right? Let's say we have a parameter, or sorry, oh my gosh, let's say we have a procedure. It's getting late. Let's say we have a procedure and we have a specific parameter that we're passing into that procedure, right? What we can say is, or the specific parameter that's being used to write that procedure. What we can say is we can pass multiple arguments in to that procedure as parameters, right? And so since each of those parameters are kind of representing a general version of an argument that we could pass in, that's managing complexity because instead of writing that whole procedure out for a specific argument, we're writing out for a parameter. And because we're writing out for parameter, we can actually pass in multiple different values as that parameter. So we're managing complexity because we are abstracting what we're writing to something that is more general and can be used with many different arguments. That's how we would say that. Does that make sense? So we just walked them through making an if-else statement for this. Yes, this is pretty much exactly it. Yeah. Um, are we just telling them how to write out segments of a code that has an equal to statement? Kind of. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's take a look exactly how we would do this. So this is not going to really tell us. It just says explain the detailed steps in the algorithm. Here's the answer, right? The answer is okay. We're working with the procedure is equal and our list, right, that we identified. So what we need to do is first initialize some variable, call it count, call it whatever, right? Just the number of times that we hit this is equal to being true, right? And then what we need to do is iterate through our list and for each item in the list, we need to check if that value is equal to whatever pre-specified value we have. So we'd have to call if this is equal with the value of our list at that point, comma, whatever value we're checking for. If that returns true, then we need to increase our counter, right? Because we want to add 1 to the number of times we hit this being equal. And so that's all we need to do. And at the end, we can call display return call display our account, return our count, whatever, right? As long as we somehow kind of identify that count. So what Quirrell said is exactly right. Is there any questions on how we do that? The idea is, okay, let's see. Set value 1 to something like bird you want to find. Set value 2 to item 1 in the list. Set count to 0. Repeat length of list times. If value 1 equals value 2, then count equals count plus 1, then value 2 equals value 2 plus 1 display count. So that's like almost there. The only qualm I have with that is the if statement, where it says if value 1 is equal to value 2, because you're exactly right, right? This is exactly what we're trying to do, except we actually have to use this is equal thing because they told us to use this equal thing, right? So if you called if is equal value 1 comma value 2, then you're all good. As long as you know you access your list to call the value of value 1, right? Or sorry, value 2. Do we just say that at the top then? You actually have to call the is equals to be able to get the point. Compare the variables in our list. That's essentially what the question is asking. But we need to be able to, okay. Let me generalize this question for us, okay? Um, Let me answer some questions and we'll do that. So say is equal at the top of your code. Well, the is equal has to be called in your if statement. So you have to call is equal in that if statement remedy. Are we supposed to just create a list for this or talk about this is about the list in your PPR. This is all question 2 is always going to ask about stuff in your specific PPR. Okay, so I want to real quick talk about how this question is asked, right? In general. So in general, this is how you're going to get this like suppose you're provided with a procedure, blah blah blah, right? This is all you're going to need to do every time. You're going to always have to go through your list with a loop. And then in that loop, you're going to have to call the procedure that they give you. Okay, so if you're ever asked about this whole thing, suppose you're given a procedure and suppose, you need to go through your list and count the number of items that returns true for this procedure. You're always going to need to go, use a loop to go through your list and then call whatever procedure is being asked of you. And then from there, once you've done those two steps, you can fill in the rest of like, okay, this specific one is I need to create a count variable and then count the number of times it returns true, right? And then we display that count. But you always are going to go through the loop and call the procedure that they give you with that procedure. Yes, okay, can I write a code segment? Let me do that. Whoa. So here, I'll send out those again, just as a reminder for you guys. But let me write out a code segment. So the idea is, here's our code, right? We want to first set a count variable equal to 0, because we need to be able to go through our count and figure out how many times this is equals is returning true. Cool? The next thing we need to do, and let me go ahead and put this super in like, fancy. This is the font they use, right? Next thing that you need to do is repeat and go through a loop. So this is what I'm saying. We always need to go through our loop. So go through our list. So for num, we'll say index actually in my list, right? So I don't care. It doesn't matter what your list is called, but as long as you use whatever your list is, you need to go through for every index, actually we'll say element in your list, right? So from there, what we need to do is remember, we're always going to go through our list with a loop, and we're always going to call the function that they give us. So is equal, and we're going to, in this case, we're looking to see if the value that's in our list, so element, is equal to some value that was specified in the question. So if this is true, then we need to increment our count, right? So we'll say count equals count plus 1. And then once we do that, we can go through this whole thing for all of our lists, right? For all the lists, this whole loop, and we'll just go ahead and return or display count. And that's going to be the pseudocode. So how are we going to do this all in the exam? This is why you're getting this question right here is why you're given an hour to do these. If we use pseudocode technically incorrectly, i.e. saying count plus plus, that's fine. Nope, they will understand. Don't worry about it. They're not using, you can use any pseudocode that you want. Yeah. As long as they get what you're saying. But we're telling them how to do this in words. You can either use this kind of pseudocode or you can write it in English. This is not for response to C from last year, but it's extremely similar, and we'll actually see it in these practice. Yes, yep, I will keep that example on the slides. So you can come back to it. All right, so let's go ahead and oh, sorry, Remedy, let me take a look. Yes, that should be fine. That's not exactly obviously going to work as a piece of code, but that should work as pseudocode for the exam. All right, so here are a list of terms that you want to be familiar with for the exam. You should all be familiar with these. These are stuff that you learn in the course. It's not a huge deal, right? But these are the terms that you want to be familiar with. And then as far as the action verbs that yes, I can. Okay, so as far as the action verbs as well, these will be on the slide. So if you need to come back to them, you're welcome to. So I'm not going to cover them super a lot here, especially because we need to get moving along. But as far as the action verbs that you could be asked, the three that are most confusing for people are explain, describe, and identify. This is quite literally just why, how, and what. So if you can say answer what the answer is, you just identify it, right? If you need to describe how something works, no, but that's actually what we're going to be doing next with Alicia, so don't worry. And explain is answer why with justification. So if they ask you to explain something, you have to justify it from information in your code. So here's how we're going to do the practice. So we're going to do one more set of FRQs today. This should take hopefully close to an hour, and that'll be about 2 hours. This is the first set from the 2024 FRQs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the prompt. Then I'll leave about 5 minutes. We're a little bit tight on time, so we're going to do only about 5 minutes. But we're going to have you guys write your own responses. Okay? So some of us have already been writing them. For those of us who not, I'm going to encourage us to go ahead and write our responses for these ones. And then what we're going to do is see the grading criteria. I'll explain each point, and I'll let you guys grade your own. So I'm not going to be able to grade anybody's specific responses. Yes, I can. So no, I'm not going to be able to grade anybody's specific responses. But what I can say is I'll show you guys the grading responses, the grading criteria, and you can grade your own. And then to even kind of further help us, we're going to take a look at two different student responses, one that got the point and one that didn't for each question. And then we'll go ahead and determine which one got the point and which one didn't. So let's do the first one. I'll read it and then I'll give you guys 5 minutes. So, programs accept input to achieve their intended functionality. Describe at least one valid input to your program and what your program does with that input. So I'll give you guys 5 minutes. Take a look, see if you can write your own response, and we'll come back together. Nope, this is just about your code in general, your program in general. So it doesn't have to be from the procedure in PPR, just has to be the code in general. Yep, we're going to do the check validity one together. That's going to be our last one. But as foreshadowing, it's pretty much the exact same as is equal. I appreciate that. I'll send the link to the lecture feedbacks form if you want to fill that out. I always appreciate the positive responses. No problem. I appreciate that. Yeah, the cool savage is the lecture lead for Math CS, and I'm the lecture lead for like the whole thing. So, I hope that we're good. Not the best. I'm always hopeful that we have really good lecturers, but I would also hope that we're good. Good. I'm glad he's helped. He writes some really good multiple choice questions as well. So, yeah, he's very good. My username is cjazz__. No worries, Nandini. Gonna have about 2 minutes left to finish up your responses, and then we're gonna go over them. And of course, you'll have more time on test day, right? Yep, 3 to 4 sentences is just fine. Especially for this first one, not that big a deal, right? It's just asking to describe one thing. That's about 3 to 4 sentences. That's good. Yep, anywhere from 3 to 5 for describing is good. I'd say more like a paragraph for explaining is probably the standard. 5 may be a bit much for describing, but it really as they can only give you 1 point, right? So it's either you described it or you didn't. So um yeah. Yep, Nandini, your answer looks like this has a good length. Yep. If you describe it in one sentence, as long as you, we'll see some examples, but as long as you actually are able to describe it in one sentence, then you should be okay. But I think it's always, they tell you to aim for more than that just so that you, like, for sure describe it in detail enough. Is it specific enough? I am not sure. If I have to read every one person's, then I'm going to have to read everybody's, and that's going to take too long. Do you have to grade yourself? Yeah. So I'm not, yeah, like I said, I'm not going to actually be grading them. We're going to go ahead and go over the scoring guidelines. So you guys can just grade yourselves. And we'll be able to see some student responses and do that. So, okay. Does correct grammar matter? I don't think so, as long as they understand what you're saying. All right. So the idea is for this one, you can first describe at least one valid input to the program and then say what that program does with the input. So, like I said, these are going to be more specific to your thing, but like for example, any either specific example of an input or description of the input can meet this criteria, right? So it doesn't have to be the specific input as long as you say like, oh, the user inputs this, then that would be a description. So that's good. Other forms of input could be databases, device inputs such as sensors, command line arguments, anything, right? As long as it's an input to your program, right? And then the response does not need to be to describe all valid inputs. It just needs to describe one, right? Sorry, it does not need to describe all valid inputs to the program and what the program does with all these inputs, but all descriptions must be given that are given must be correct. Okay, so let's go ahead and do look at a like a sample of one student's response. So I'll go ahead and read them because sometimes they can be a little bit hard to read. This is probably one of the better ones that we're going to get today. So, but let's take a look. So one valid input in my program that my program has is quote first underscore input equals input uh, parentheses quote what color is made by mixing the colors red and blue together. My program takes this input and lets the user, a child who is still learning their colors, answer the question. The program uses this input to help further educate children, generally in grades K through second grade, to help them further their knowledge in colors. They need help to understand what colors mix to create other colors, which can help them learn more for school. So, did this response, what do you guys think? Did this response describe at least one valid input of the program? What do you guys think? Here's what they said. Remember, first input equals input. So you may think they did, right? But on further inspection, they didn't really, right? Because what they're saying is this input thing is taking input from the user, right? So it's really what they wrote in their response is quote what color is made by mixing the colors red and blue together. That's just a question that you're posing to the user, right? You didn't actually take any input. That's just a question that you're putting out there, right? So when we take a look and see what they say the response does not describe at least one valid input to the program because the input described in the response is, quote, first underscore input equals input, right? This is the prompt that the user is given, but the response doesn't actually give the valid input that's accepted by the program. So do we see the nuance here? This is why I like this example, right? Because how they word it to make it correct, that's a great question. So what they would say is, one valid input to my program is is the color that the user types in or the string that the user types in that's describing a color that you get when you mix red and blue together. Does that make sense? So it's the string that they actually provide that's the input. It's not the actual prompting that's the input. It could be a drop down. I don't see their code, right? So they could be a drop down. I'm not sure, right? If it's whatever it would be, right? So the input is the drop down that is selected or the string that's being provided, right? It's not the prompt itself. And then it says this response does not actually even describe what the program does with the input, right? The response writes about how the user would use the program, but not what happens to the input once it's in the code, right? So using this, you can kind of look at your response, see how you did. If you didn't get the point, that's okay, right? This is the whole point of this is the practice, right? So let's take a look at this one. And so if that one didn't get the point, we know this one is going to get the point. So we're going to see why. So I'll read it. The response says, quote, my program takes a string from the user as input. The program then takes that string and counts how often each letter appears in the string. This is done by incrementing the value of a key in the dictionary that corresponds with the letter. A dictionary, by the way, is something specific to Python, I think. I don't remember, but if you don't know what it is, it's not a problem. There will be a key for each letter in the string. This dictionary is then returned to the user. So, did this response describe the input? Yes, they did, right? They said it's the string that the user inputs, right? Then does it describe what the program does with the input? It does that too, right? It says how it uses the string, right? It says it's being stored in a dictionary and then it's returned to the user, all that stuff, right? So it's doing the nitty-gritty of like what it's actually doing, right? So when it says describe at least one valid input to your program and what the program does with that input, they're asking you to describe what is how that input is manipulated in your program, right? It could be JavaScript. I don't remember it. You're. I think you're. I believe you're right. I've not done Python or JavaScript in like forever, so it's been a long time. Yeah, no worries. All right, so this response earned both of the points, or sorry, it earned the point because it demonstrated both of the criteria, right? So the first criteria, the response describes at least one valid input to the program, and the response describes what the program does with the input. So any questions with this first question? Any of the things that we covered here before we move on to the second question? Nope. If my input is taken from a list to broadcast, would that be okay? Yeah, as long as your um, program is describing a list, right? Or sorry, is describing an input. So, for example, there's a bunch of these forms of that the input could take. Um, so, as long as it is the input or a description of the input, then yeah, it's okay. So, like for example, if you have a list that you're importing um, into your program and you're taking that input from that list, then you're good. The user clicks the option which takes from a list to broadcast. Yes. Yep. So that's as long as you say the input is um, the option that the user clicks, right? All right. So let's go ahead and move on to set, question two. So again, we'll do the same thing. I will give you guys a few minutes. Consider the first iteration statement included in the procedure section of your personalized project's reference. Describe what is being accomplished by the body of the code in your iteration statement. The body is late. Describe what is being accomplished by the code in your bot. Oh my gosh, in the body of the iteration statement. And there you go. So I'll give you guys 5 minutes, 9:21, and we'll get back together. It's not even that late. I don't know why I'm like screwing up my words, but reading is hard. I agree. And when we're doing this, I'm actually going to run and grab a little bit more water. So I'll be right back. Okay. and you give some background about your project, yeah, as long as yeah, I mean you can write whatever you want as long as it's accurate. Um, they're gonna just be grading you though on if you describe what is being accomplished by the body of your code. If I made a program about rock, paper, scissors, could I say that the code keeps score through the iteration statement uh, by traversing through each user choice? Yes. So you want to be a little bit more in depth, right? So if you have your project reference with you, you can go through line by line and kind of describe exactly how your code is working. I think that's really what they want. You don't have the screenshot saved, but I don't know what part of the code it's asking about. Okay, so let's talk about that. So what it's looking for is the first iteration statement, right? So can somebody remind me what an iteration statement is? A loop, right? Um, yeah, so we're looking for the first. You're good, you're good. We're looking for the first statement in your code, in the procedure of your code, that is under or as a part of a loop. And that's an iteration statement. Or really, the iteration statement itself is the loop, right? So do I need to literally explain what the iteration does step by step, or do I explain what it does for my program generally? Well, let's see what they wanted. They wanted you to just straight up explain or describe what is being accomplished by the code in the body of the iteration statement. So, um, what that means is uh, what the iteration is accomplishing more generally, really, is what they want. But if you say that, uh, if you use the step by step to get to that more general, then that would be a good way to do like approach this question. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. So some points here, right? The iteration statement does not need to be contained in the procedure, although typically for a lot of people it is. Yep, you have 60 minutes for each of the for all the FRQs in total. Um, the response may describe a summary of what the iteration does in the context of the program, or describe the purpose of each statement in the body. So this is what I'm saying, right? You can either do it in general, or you can go line by line and describe the purpose of each statement. Either one is fine. FRQs are always super long. So let's think about how we can like approach the test then, right? If you always, tend to have like long FRQs, then what we can say is, okay, well, maybe we can kind of approach the questions by reading each of them, seeing which one's going to be the longest, doing that one first, and then working our way backwards, right? Or we can kind of plot out some planning on each question that we want to do, and then kind of use that planning to shorten the amount of time and make the responses more concise, right? Okay. Again, remember, it doesn't really matter if your responses are short or long. What matters is that you respond to the criteria, right? So let's take a look at, and by the way, that was shown in this example, right? This was super long compared to this one, right? This is a few sentences. This is like a whole paragraph. And we see that this one is really the one that earned the point. So you see, it doesn't really matter, right? So let's take a look at this. Student E, I'll read again the uh, the response. It says the card logic function is used by the computer to determine what card of its hand needs to be changed to by comparing each card to each other and finding the match. Then sends back what card needs to be changed. The card logic function is only called once and it's inside the computer play function and it's comparing all of the computer's cards and saving which one to change and storing it inside the variable results. So what do you guys think? Does this describe what's being accomplished by the code in the body of the iteration statement? I actually don't remember. I think it does though, right? Oh no, it didn't. I thought it did, but I guess it didn't, right? So let's take a look at why though. The response describes what is being accomplished by the body of the code in the body of the procedure. However, the body of the procedure does not contain iteration, nor is the iteration present in the additional procedure. So it did effectively describe what's being inside of the statement, right? So we're all good there. So if you guys kind of had a level of, yeah, if you guys have a level of explanation like this guy did, then you guys are okay, right? Because that's what they said. You're good. Yeah, that's I forgot. That's why I included the PPR in this one. And actually I did it for the rest of them too. But yeah. So if we take a look at the thing, we see that these are all if statements, right? There's no for loops or any loops or anything. So we did not get the point because there was no iteration in this procedure. But this is a good example of how like the level of detail that you could have gone in your response, right? It's because this is more of an overview summary, but it was a fine summary, right? It's just that he didn't actually use uh, any loops or any iteration. So, any questions with this student before we move on? I got fooled. I can't believe it. So, as long as you have iteration and you write a response like this, you would have gotten the point. Oh, so he would have if he had the loop. Exactly. If he had the loop and he told us what the loop did in this explanation, then yeah, he would have gotten the point. Did he talk about the wrong section, or did he just not? He just straight up didn't have a loop in his PPR. And actually, this is the procedure, right? So he didn't have a loop in his PPR here, and so since there's no loop, he couldn't have gotten the point. But he did. Yeah, he really sold with his code, right? Because he did have a really good explanation. So okay, here's Vivilish. Here's how you explain it, right? If you can tell us what your function in your PPR is doing, at a high level, right? High level overview. It's just saying, for example, it's comparing each card to each other and finding the best match and then returning the best match, right? And that's fine. But he didn't have a loop in here. So let's take a look. Um, yep, that looks like a fine example of iteration. All right, for Piccolo City. Can we just use ChatGPT to generate the perfect answer and then model ours based on it? I mean, if you want to, but there are some like good and there like this is a good one. We'll see what this is, but like there are some good examples that you could model yours based off of already, right? So if you kind of see what they want from you, maybe it'd be better to do that. If I was to write some practice free responses, would someone be able to look over them for me tomorrow? Maybe I might have time, but I'm pretty busy for the rest of the week. But if you want to send it and just send it in the CSP chat, I'm sure somebody can take a look. Can you just use ChatGPT on the exam? I wish. Um, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Kind of like exchanging grading. That's a great idea. All right. So let's take a look at this one. Uh, if my code is trying to find the correct element according to a user's choosing, I'm not sure about your code, right? As long as you can do a high level overview of just saying like, here's what I did to create my function, then you're gonna get the point. And the function has a loop in it. Then and you kind of explain what that loop does, then you're good. So let's take a look at this, and we'll see an example of that. So I'll read it. The first iteration statement is, quote, for I in range of this. This statement runs code that searches for a specific value given to the program by the user and removes the part of the of the list that is equal to this value. Every value that is not equal to the specified value will get appended to a second playlist, playlist 2, to ensure the playlist is an accurate representation of what the user wanted to listen to. So what we see here is it just straight up explains what is going on in this loop, right? So for every statement or for every value, we're looking to see if it matches the one that's given by the user, and if it does, it's going to go into the other playlist. If it not, then it's not, right? So this is a perfect example, right? Because it's, as we said, going at a high level overview of what's happening in the code using the for loop. Questions with this one and why it earned the point? Definitely earned the point. Yep. Got two on the next day. Oh my gosh. Next Friday. Oof. Good luck. Physics is terrible. All right. So any no more questions with this one, right? All right, let's go. Great. Let's go to question 2B. By the way, th do we remember how I said that this 2A, this one here, we said this is doing the like going to be just having you describe what your code is doing, right? That was quite literally, if we go all the way back to our 2A here, that is this right here. So for each of them, we have quite literally what they're going to have you or what they're going to ask you. Explain how code segment works, right? So these are the prompts. They're just going to be more detailed. The prompts are going to be more detailed than these. So remember that these exist because these are really going to be what they're going to ask you. Okay, let's go back to our uh to B. Again, I'll give you 5 minutes or so to take a look and write out your answer. So I'll read it. Consider the procedure identified in part 1 of your procedure section of your personalized project reference. We want to write 2 calls to your procedure that each cause a different code segment in the procedure to execute. Describe the expected behavior of each call. If it is not possible for 2 calls to your procedure to cause different code segments to execute, explain why this is the case for your procedure. What does it mean by call again, like if an if statement or loop? It means when it says call, it just means writing a call to that procedure, right? So it's going to be calling the procedure. Yeah, yeah, like Armand's saying, right? So if you have a procedure called my procedure, then you would call that procedure by passing all the arguments into it and calling that procedure in your statement or in your program. If it doesn't, then explaining why not will give you the point. Yep, exactly. Yep, it's going to be a function. It's going to be the function name being called in your program. Yes, as long as you can. Yes, yes. So the preconditions, by that I mean, I'm assuming you mean like passing in different arguments, right? Initializing a constant variable that's randomly assigned. Yeah. So as long as the 2 calls that you give can cause different parts of your program to execute, then yeah, you can do whatever preconditions you want. Remember, we need to describe the expected behavior of each call as well, right? If I have 2 function calls in that part of the PPR, do I just pick one to talk about? Um, this question is asking you to write 2 calls, right? So you don't actually need to talk. You don't actually need to talk about the calls uh, that you make, right, in your procedure or your personalized project reference. You just need to actually write 2 more calls, right, to demonstrate the 2 different parts of your program that run. We have about 2 more minutes here, and we'll go over it. Remember, yeah, you do need to actually describe the two calls, right? Describe the expected behavior of the two calls, right? And how they work. So, wait, it needs to be a call. I haven't already done my code. You can have done it. You may have done it in your code. That's fine. It doesn't really matter if you did it in your code or not. It just needs to be two calls that you write on the test, right? So, Jenna, if your procedure takes in the coordinates, for example, then you may be able to, I mean, it just depends on what's in your inside of your procedure, right? So if there's no possible way to have two different code segments in the procedure execute because it's just you're always taking in the same thing and like you're not changing anything with that or anything, like that's fine. But be able to explain why. And we'll see some examples as well. Nope, grammar does not have to be perfect, as is the case with like every AP exam, I think. Uh, if you don't remember the items for your list, remember you're expected to write two calls, right? So you can write any numbers in your list. So it doesn't really matter to use for your call. It doesn't really matter what you use in the call as long as whatever you use in the call allows you to explain how or allows two different parts of your code segments to execute. See what I'm saying? Because you're writing two brand new calls. Okay, let's go over it. Oh, English lit maybe, yeah. Okay, so we need to include two calls to the procedure, and each call must cause a different program code segment to execute in the procedure. And then you need to also describe the expected behavior of these calls, or you can explain why it's not possible, right? So that's basically exactly what the question's saying. Some kind of points here. Um, if the procedure identified in the written response to determine whether you need to use the procedure in the PPR, a procedure that uses its parameters to execute two different code segments can earn this point. So for example, if you have two calls with different parameters and each of the parameters cause different things to execute in the function, then you would get the point. The syntax of the procedure does not need to be correct as long as the correct arguments are identified. A general description of the argument is considered acceptable, right? So I can also just do general description as well. Description of each call rather than the actual code is also acceptable. Any questions with the scoring guidelines before we actually see the examples? All right. If my calls cause the same code segment to run, so I need to say why I don't need two calls. Yes. So if you can't write any two calls that don't allow different code segments to execute, then you need to explain why that's the case. All right. So I'll read this one. If the if the calculate procedure was called with the parameters 2 plus 3, comma 1, comma 2, it would run the code segment that adds 2 to 3, removes plus and both ones, stores the value of 2 plus 3 in calc answer, and adds the value back into the equation list. However, if the parameters were to be 2 times 3, 1, comma 2, it would run a similar code segment that multiplies instead of adds and would return the value 6 instead of 5. So what do you guys think? Is this acceptable? Or would this earn the point? Yes, I agree. I also think it would earn the point. And the reason is because the two different parts of the procedure that are being executed is the multiplication section and the addition section, right? So these if statements here, if and if, are causing different segments to execute. Cool? And there's the answer. So the response includes two calls to the procedure, for example, this call and this call. And then the response also describes the expected behavior of the first call, which stores the value of 2 plus 3 in calc answer and adds the value back in the equation list. And that of the second call multiplies instead of adds and will return the value 6 instead of 5. So pretty straightforward, right? If you identify two calls and describe them, then you earn the point. Um, let's take a look at this one then. Quote, in this procedure, there's only one possible call because no other call could trigger different parts of my code. An example of my call would be, quote, remove underscore song sicko mode. The procedure can only run one segment of code because only one code segment is necessary to fulfill the tasks of my program. So what do you guys think? Sicko mode. This guy was crazy, right? So let's take a look at the procedure, right? Is there anything in the procedure that would allow two different segments of the code to run? Because this guy's claiming that there's not, right? There is an else, right? Yeah, exactly. So there's an if and there's an else, right? So if the playlist, so if the song is in the playlist, right? If that playlist name is the name that we're given, then we need to remove it from the playlist. But if it's not in the playlist, then we need to append it to the other playlist, right? So this guy is saying, okay, well, I can't do any call that's going to remove, that's going to not cause all of the thing to run. But it actually is the case that uh, if we call sicko mode and sicko mode was in playlist one, it would be removed. But if it's not, then it's going to be added to playlist two, right? So that would be um, two different calls that you could make, and that would cause two different parts to be affected. So this guy would not get the point. That's not affected by the parameters, though. So it actually, you're right. So it's not going to be affected by the parameter. So thank you for pointing this out. Yes. So because the name is actually being overridden by the input here, right? So so that doesn't mean that there's not still two different things that could be called based on what the user inputs, right? So the user inputs a name, right? So you would still need to say that even though it doesn't depend on the parameters, there are still two ways that you could call the function and have two different ways of affecting it, right? And so we'll see how this works here. So the response explains why it's not possible for a procedure to cause different code segments to execute. Quote, there's only one possible call because no other call could trigger different parts of my code. However, this explanation is not correct. A call to the procedure with the name of a song that is in the list, quote, playlist one, will cause the body of the if statement to execute, while a call to the procedure with the name of the song that's not in the list will cause the else statement to execute. In addition, the parameter name is overridden before it is used. So does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Can he just have a call that removes a song from playlist one or two? So yeah, so he would need to have two calls though, right? One that's in the playlist one and one that's not, so that you can add it to playlist two. What if I have an else, but it will never run because it is always greater than zero? Would that answer the last part of the question? If you if you have an else that's never gonna call, then and you point that out in your response, then yeah, I mean, then yes, that would work. But you should that's like a very niche case, right? Because if you that would be like assuming that you have an error in your code then, right? If the procedure is called under different conditions and execute state segments of code depending on condition, does that count? Yes. Yes, that does count. This is what this should have said, right? So, for example, there's two different conditions here. The first is that it's in the playlist one, and the second that it's not, right? So, two different conditions. You should say, okay, the two different conditions are this and this. If you called it with this condition, then this one would be removed, and if you called it with the other condition, then it would be added to the playlist too. So yes, does that answer Remedy? Wait, so what causes the else to trigger? Can you go back and explain? Yeah, so if exactly, so if okay, yeah, it seems like you got it. But the idea is if the playlist thing that we're on is equal to the name that we're inputted. So in other words, if this song is in playlist one, then we need to remove it. Else, if it's not in playlist one, then we need to add it to the second playlist. Does it count as a different code segment if, like, for example, the user mouse click is not in the boundaries, none of the code would run compared to if, so it actually has to be called, you have to call the procedure, right? So if inside the procedure you check to see whether or not you're in bounds and you like break the procedure, you return if it's not in bounds, then yes, that would count as a different call. But if you just straight up don't even call the procedure if you're not in bounds, then no. So it's just very context dependent. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. So, did we do the other one? Yes, we did. Okay, so here's procedure question C. Does it count as different code segment if the procedure call affects which iteration in the loop the code segment runs? Count as a different code segment if the procedure call affects which iteration? Yes, it does. So it's this is all about selection, right? Because the idea is you're selecting which code segment to run based off of what you input. Yeah? Yeah, I would also be glad to do it with my code. All right, so I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes here to do question 2C, and then we'll go over it. So this is the check validity one. Suppose another programmer provides you with a procedure called check validity value that returns true if the value passed as an argument is considered valid by the other programmer and returns false otherwise. Um, Using the list identified in the list section of your personalized project reference, explain in detailed steps an algorithm that uses check validity to check whether all elements in your list are considered valid by the other programmer. Your explanation must be detailed enough for someone else to write the code for the algorithm that uses check validity. Yes, I can briefly review what's on the previous slide. This one here is just saying that this response didn't earn the point um, because it claimed that there was no way to have it not run everything, but indeed, actually, there was a way. If playlist one, if the name that we're looking for was in playlist one, then we'd remove it. But if it not, then we would append it to a second playlist. Yes, you can just use the exact same code for is equal and place is equal with is validity and pretty much. Yeah. Yeah, and just if the count is length, then yes, yeah. So Vivalicious, the first one in that one earned the point, the second one didn't. If you go onto the slideshow, then you'll be able to see it. Oh, sorry, I should go to this one. Yeah, there we go. So I'll give you guys about 5 minutes here. Look it over, see if you can write the answer, and we'll reconvene. Okay. I love pho. That's great. Vietnamese is the best. Probably my favorite cuisine, actually. And while we're kind of writing this, yep, I'll write a sample for this one as well. While we're kind of writing this, I just want to go ahead and send this message again, which just has the feedback form and the lecture schedule. So if you guys are enjoying the lecture or you have any feedback for me, positive, critical, anything is good. I appreciate all of it, and I use it all to make the lectures better. So you can fill out that form. And then the lecture schedule gives you access to all the previous resources for all my lectures, all the recordings, all the future lectures, all the future lecture resources, all of that stuff as well. Yes, you're right. So this is a little bit different because it's not asking for the number. It's just asking for whether all of them are considered true. You feel like whatever you wrote didn't make sense? Okay, don't worry. We'll go over exactly how you should answer it. See, people think that APCSP is the easiest class, but also administrators think it's the easiest class, which means they give you the worst teachers. So actually it ends up being like not the easiest class. Yes, I will write the pseudocode for this one as well. Don't worry. Loki, you're stuck on the calls for this one. No worries. We'll go over it. I'm gonna give you guys about 3 more minutes here, and then we'll go over it. Oh, they're a grader? Oh, that's awesome. See, it's I maybe I made that maybe that was an overgeneralization then, I guess. Yes, if you don't do 2C, but the rest you get full marks for, it's 5 out of 6. That's absolutely right. So you can miss one if you miss one for your response and you get all of the multiple choice questions right, then that's still a 5. Yep, you can write it all in plain English. That's completely fine. CSP has a very weird curve, which we'll talk about a little bit more on Tuesday. Yep, so if FRQ is 5 out of 6, multiple choice is 65 out of 70, then that should still be a 5. Yep. That should be like the lowest possible for a 5. According to the 2022 curve, right? They obviously they change the curve every year, so we can't say anything specifically, but you know, 2022 Albert IO, whatever, that's what it would be for that. Okay, we'll give us 1 more minute here and we'll go over it. Don't worry. Actually, this class was my first experience with anything computer science, and I took it as a senior. So, um, yeah, don't even worry. All right, so let's go ahead and go over it. So here are the scoring guidelines, and again, I'll go ahead and create another copy of this and delete these to write the pseudocode. But let's first go over the scoring guidelines. Pretty simple. It just says explains the detailed steps and algorithm that uses check validity to check whether all elements are a list are valid. But some things to point out, it can be described in code, pseudocode, a sequence of steps in English, or as paragraph in English. Any of these are fine. Um, and then the algorithm must describe how each element on the identified list is passed into check validity, at least to up to the first invalid element, if applicable. So all this is saying is you have to do what we said you have to do when you get a question like this, right? Do you guys remember what we said we have to do whenever we get a question like this? Iterate through the list. Yes, iterate through the list and call the procedure on each element, right? That's what you're gonna have to do for like everything. So as long as you do that in this bullet point, then and the rest of the procedure is correct, then you should be okay. So let's write the pseudocode here. So remember, we need to do an algorithm that uses check validity to check whether all elements in your list are valid. So what do we do? Well, let's first write out the exact thing that we said we always need to do when we get these types of questions, right? For each element in my list, right? So in other words, do a for loop that iterates through all the elements in your list, yeah? Then what we said next was we need to call that procedure, right? So we said call is valid, I think is what it was called, right? And we pass an element. So how do we go from here? So we know we do these two things and we get, that's part of the answer, right? So the rest of the question was we need to check if all the elements are valid, right? So I could copy paste it, but from the is equal, but I want to write it here. So um, is valid element. So we know this is going to return true if it's valid, right? So if it's not valid, we know we're going to have to stop the algorithm, right? So what we can say is if it's the case that this returns uh, false, then we want to stop. So what we can say is if not this, or we can say if is maybe it may make more a little bit sense if we did this. If is valid element is false, right? If this is the case, Then we said we want to straight up return or stop the procedure or whatever, right? Return uh, false. And then otherwise, we can return true. Now, that's one way to write this, right? Um, this is one way to write it. The other way to write it would be doing what we did for is equal. So now I'll go ahead and copy paste. So let me find where we did that. So I'll actually change this to Choreo new and paste this. Okay, so the other way to do this would be just like doing this, right? For element in my list, instead of saying is equal, we say is valid. And we say element, right? So if it's the case that this is valid, then we can add one to our count, right? And then if in the end um, we get our count being equal to the number of elements in our list, which would be length my list, then we know that we need to display or return true, right? Otherwise, we'd want to return false. So, questions with how we went about doing this. Should I write for each element? Um, okay, I missed some questions here. Let me go back here. What if you have multiple parts in one index in my list? Does that matter? No. What that means is what the question's asking is that my check validity not is valid. Sorry. It's fine. This is basically saying you can pass in any one index of your list. So it doesn't matter if you have multiple things in one index. Shouldn't you write for each element? Yep, so for each element right here. Is that what you mean? Um, by the way, is writing code required for APCSP for response? No. So this is the pseudocode that you could write. You don't need to write this. You could write it in English, right? Steps in English or as a paragraph in English. Anything is fine. Hi, I joined late. So is that the answer to the question? Yep, that's the answer to the check validity question. But you're welcome to look at these slides. They're going to be posted in the lecture schedule here. Actually, I'll just go ahead and send the link here. Scratch has no for loops, and I am used to repeat length lists and add one to the index. Is that okay? Yep, that's completely fine. And then as long as at the end you say as long as the count that we did is equal to the length, then we can return true. Is the second one you did if in the second one you did write for each, or is it supposed to be just for? Um, well, we could do a for this is someone, yeah. So we could do a for loop here, right? And say for, I equals 0 or you know, we could do like a for loop and say from 0 to the length of the list and then use the list bracket I, right? Or we could say the for element in my list where the element is just the element that we're looking at, that specific one. This is just the AP style. So I think you're just talking about like an AP style question, if that makes sense. So this is the style they do with the pseudocode. You can answer this in pseudocode. If so, you can be in, yes, it can be in any code that you want. You can write in any code that you want. It can be in English. It could be this AP style pseudocode. It could be, you could draw blocks. It doesn't matter, right? As long as you can straight just identify what you're talking about, as long as the grader can identify how you're describing it, then you're fine. All right, so let's go ahead and look at some student responses. So I'll go ahead and read them and we can decide whether they earn the point or not. So this one says, the list that I created is called, quote, sorting list. Using the procedure check validity true, it is possible to create an algorithm to check the validity of a value. To create the algorithm, it is best to use a for I loop to iterate each spot in the list. Using example list, bracket A, B, C, C, D. The procedure, I think this is E, A, B, C, E, D. The procedure can start off with saying if the first element is an A, return true, else return false. Then, if the second element is A, B, return true, else return false. Next, we can say that if the third element is is a C, return true, else return false. Then, if the fourth element is a C, return true, else return false. finally, uh, if the last element is a B, return true, else return false. If all returned as true, the list is considered valid. Is this correct or incorrect? Can someone paste the question in chat? Yes, I'll paste it right now. So you guys are saying wrong. Yeah, you guys are exactly right. It's wrong. They mentioned the procedure in the first few lines. They did say we can use the procedure check validity as possible to create an algorithm, right? So they say it's possible, but then the algorithm that they actually described, does the algorithm they describe use the thing? No, they didn't, right? Yeah, he doesn't actually use it. He just says he just says it's possible and then he yaps for a little bit, right? So yeah, so you guys are exactly right. It's wrong because he didn't actually use it in the algorithm. And then also, if we actually look and see what his algorithm is doing, right? If the first thing he does, right? He says if the first element is an A, return true, else return false. Do you guys remember what return values or return statements do? Can somebody tell me in general what a return statement does? It ends the program, right? So if you're ending the program on the first iteration, right, then you're just straight up just like skipping everything, right? So as soon as he says return true or return false, all the rest of this stuff is useless, right? Because he ends the program right here. So um yeah, so what he could have done, Nandini says he should have used display. He could have done that. I think a better kind of approach to this question might have been because we want to see if all of them are true, right? So a better one may have said, okay, let's call is valid on the first element. And if that returns true, then we can continue. Else, if it doesn't return true, we need to then return false. And then we do this for all of the values in the list. Does that make sense how we do that? Because it's the idea is that we need to call this is valid or check validity function for the first element. And if it's true, we want to continue. But if it's not true, if it's false, then we want to actually return and stop the program and say false, right? Because we hit a value that's not false. Oh my gosh, that's not true. Does that make sense to you guys? So we could print it, except the problem with a print statement is that we can't actually store the result of that call, right? So what we need to be checking is that all of the calls are true, right? But if we just print a call, then we don't actually store that to see at the end of the for loop if we actually had true or not, right? To the human eye, if we print something, we can easily see, oh, these are all true, so we're good, right? But the question is actually asking us to determine whether all the elements are considered valid. So we would actually need to, at the end of this for loop or the end of this loop, be able to say, oh, not all the things are valid. And we can't actually do that if we print them, right? Because we don't actually store any memory of that. So is pseudocode considered explaining? Yes, it is. Yep. So here we say you can use pseudocode, actual code, English, or paragraph. Okay, so here's the response or the AP kind of answer here. It says the response does not explain in detailed steps an algorithm that uses check validity to check whether all elements are considered valid. The response describes an algorithm to iterate through the list, but the algorithm does not actually use check validity to check each element in the list. Instead, the algorithm checks elements against a particular character. Quote, the procedure can start off if the first element is an A, return true. If the second element is a B, return true. If the third element is a C, and so on. Additionally, the algorithm will not actually even check each element because it returns true or false after it checks the first element. Therefore, it will only check the first element. So we see how this is the case, and it's not actually using check validity in its argument, right? Any questions with student D here before we move on to the correct way? Wait, so this isn't tied to PPR directly, so we can write elements circularly. So it's um, So the list, he actually doesn't do this correct either, right? Because you're supposed to use the list of your personalized project reference, right? So unless this is the list that he used in the personalized project reference, you actually do need to tie it to the PPR by using that list. So this is why you actually put the list in your PPR because they might ask you a question like this. Does that make sense? So it actually is tied to the PPR, or it's supposed to be anyways, right? So let's go ahead and move on to this one. So this is student A. Okay, time to read it. You guys ready? Quote, first, set the variable valid to 0. Iterate through every key and type in the South American dictionary. Note that South America is a dictionary, which is not a list. However, it is another collection type that has a similar functionality to a list. Use selection so that if when the value parameter in the procedure check validity is the key in the dictionary, it will increase the variable valid by 1 if check validity turns true. Then, if the value parameter in the check validity procedure is set to the value in the dictionary, it will increase the variable valid by 1 if check validity returns true. Finally, to display these results, you may print display all elements are valid if the valid variable is equal to 6. The valid variable must be equal to 6 since there are 3 keys and 3 values in the dictionary for a total of 6 elements in the dictionary, all of which needed to be true and increase the value of valid to result uh, in the conclusion that all elements were valid. I'm getting lost in this gap. Sorry. He's getting the point, obviously, right? Here's an example of this code in Python, right? So he says valid, and then for key, if it's true, then increase the valid by 1. And if check validity true is true for the value, also return 1. And then if valid 6, print all elements are valid. So obviously he gets the point, right? But the question is why? Can anybody explain why he actually got the point here and the last guy didn't? Neat handwriting, that could be part of it, yeah. He didn't return in the right. Well, yeah, so he used check validity explains how it works. That's exactly right. So his code does what he was told to do. Exactly, right? So this code or this explanation is going through each value in this dictionary or list, right? It's a type of data collection, so kind of like a list. But the idea is it's going through each value in this thing and it's checking the validity of the value. And if it's valid, it's adding 1 to the count variable. At the end, if that variable is equal to the length of the list, we can print that all elements are valid. So it doesn't actually tell us like how it wants us to kind of determine, or in the like final part of it, it doesn't really say like how we need to quote unquote return our value, right? But um, what it but so that kind of leaves it up to interpretation for us. So in this case, he prints the result. You could print it. You could save it to a variable. You could return it. It doesn't really matter what you do because it doesn't say what to do, right? So in this case, though, he prints it, and this algorithm is correct because it goes through. It does exactly. If you guys take nothing away from this lecture, take this away, right? If you're given a question like this, it goes through each of the values in the list and it calls the procedure and checks if it's true, right? And that's exactly what the question's asking us to do. So any questions with why this guy got it right? Detailed steps in algorithms to check validity, whether all elements in the dictionary. Yep, I can go back real quick to the later slide. This one? Yes, yeah, thank you. Rock is the great. I don't know if I said that right, but yes, thank you for you can go ahead and view it on your own. All right, so the given algorithm uses a loop and conditional statement to count the number of elements in the dictionary for which it returns true. After the loop prints if all elements are valid, this algorithm correctly determines whether all elements are valid and is explained in sufficient detail that another programmer could implement it. So this is exactly how we want to go answering this question. So are there any questions like in general about any of the questions here? You see that that was the hardest question of the bunch, right? Any questions I can answer before we wrap up here? I have a couple more resources for you guys, and I have agenda of like the next kind of lectures, but I think that's pretty much it. You think you just need practice? Well, you're in luck because I have for you guys some more unofficial prompts here that you can look at. I wrote these up a long time, not a long time ago, last year when they were first being implemented. Yes, I'll get to the multiple choice questions here soon. Um, But these are you guys are welcome to access them. They're on the last slide here, the second to last slide. Note that this question is not realistic, but this one I do want to mention right real quick. Um, the reason why I want to mention it is because this is pretty much the inverse of the question they just asked you, right? And so they're giving you a piece of code and they're asking you to identify what it would be if you ran it on your list. So they've not asked something like this ever before, but if I had to guess, if I had to put money on it, I would bet that this is something that you may be able to see on your test as well. So just something to look at. Um, so yeah, take a look at these questions. Some of them are kind of not great because I was just kind of I was just at that point, it was kind of frantic last year because everybody was freaking out. They had no idea what was going on with the written responses. So I just kind of wrote up as much as I could. And so some of them are kind of not super great, but you're welcome to obviously take a look and just kind of look through and see what you can do. And then as far as more official prompts, you have one more set that we haven't covered from 2024. That's this link here. And then you have one more set that's being covered in a AP Daily set through these two videos as well. Whoops. If you want more specific guidance, you can look at the CED, which most of the stuff we got from this lecture was from. And then for multiple choice questions, if you guys want, you can look at this link, which is the practice exam that I went ahead and made last year. That has a bunch of questions for you guys. And then if you also want to look at on Monday, we're going to be doing another practice exam that I just made this weekend. That's going to be this one here. So you guys are welcome to do either one of those. There's answer keys for both of them. Um, the this one has the answer key within it. So if you scroll all the way down, these are all the answers. And then the other one has the answer keys in a separate document here. So what I'll say is if you're planning on going to the Monday session, don't do this practice exam 2 because that's the one that we're going to be doing here. So I see you guys are asking about the robot questions. We'll go over all the different types of multiple choice questions on Tuesday of next week, including the robot questions, including everything you may need to know. And then Wednesday is the office hours for you guys to come and check it out. If you guys have any questions at all, you can ask them Wednesday. Also Sunday, so tomorrow, Freddie is going to be also hosting some office hours as well. So please take advantage of all these sessions. Again, I'll send this copy link address. If you guys want to fill that out, you're welcome to. Again, that's just if you have any questions or, sorry, if you have any feedback for me, I'd be happy to take a look. Yes, of course, you're always welcome for the lecture. Do you guys have any other questions I can answer before we head out? Very helpful. No, great. Of course, I'm glad to hear that. How not to fail? Just do as much practice as you can. That's what I would say. Yep, of course. You guys are all getting 5s. I believe in you guys. Lifesaver. No worries, of course. Um, yes, you can post your PPR in the APCSP channel on this server, and other people may be able to help you out and take a look at that and like your answers and stuff. No problem. Let me, yeah, of course, let me know what you get. Yes, of course, guys. Yeah, thank you guys so much again for coming. If you guys want to fill out the lecture feedback form, I'll send it one more time. There's that. And yeah, good luck. I'll see you guys next time. See you guys on Monday, but also be sure to come tomorrow if you guys want to at 10 p.m.